Two signals of rank, distinct displays of dominance and prestige. So let's say you want to become a leader and rise to power. The first thing you might do is look around and say, well, how have other people done it? But the truth is that it's a bit of a complicated question. There are actually a couple of different ways that people have been known to rise to power. For example, there's a long history of some leaders using demonstrations of military force to elicit fear, whereas some seek to befriend others and generate social ties and alliances. And we see this sort of contrast across many domains, not just politics. For example, two of perhaps the most famous leaders in the tech world are Steve Jobs and Bill Gates. Both of these people are undoubtedly leaders. They have or had a tremendous amount of influence over not only the economy and pop culture, but the people around them. When they speak, other people listen, they pay attention, and they defer to these leaders. But nonetheless, these people are quite different. Steve Jobs was notorious for being abrasive. He would often yell at colleagues if things didn't meet his expectations. And yet, as a result, people were often on their best behavior when he was around. They feared the consequences of what might happen if their performance was underwhelming. Bill Gates, on the other hand, is well known for being a philanthropist. He's donated billions to charity, and interpersonally, people characterize him as being extremely nice and friendly. So, broadly, there are at least two strategies that people leverage to influence the behavior of others and rise to power. On the one hand, you can influence people's behavior with aggression and intimidation to elicit fear. This is a well-known evolutionary strategy called dominance. On the other hand, you can convey knowledge and expertise so people respect and admire you. You can influence people's behavior not by making them fear you, but by making them trust you, like you, and want to defer to you. This is a well-known evolutionary strategy called prestige. And clearly these strategies are fundamentally different from each other, and mixing them up is actually problematic for both leaders and team members. For example, let's say you're tasked to work with a leader you simply know nothing about. Chatting up and affiliating with a leader who's actually going to lash out at you, it's going to lead to a lot of undesirable interactions, possibly even harmful ones. Whereas fearing and avoiding a leader who's actually intent on sharing knowledge and being friendly will lead to lost opportunities for learning, connecting, and maybe even career advancement. So how, as humans, in the social world can we navigate this? What cues can we use to figure out who is who and engage in productive and beneficial social interactions? Today I'm going to argue that these two strategies are associated with distinct sets of nonverbal behavior. Specifically, I'm going to argue that observers rely on different nonverbal behaviors to infer dominance and prestige, and that dominant and prestigious individuals leverage these same behaviors to actually acquire their prestige and dominance in the first place, and as a result, rise to power. But before we dive into this, we need to think critically about what nonverbal displays of dominance and prestige might actually look like. Well, one way of conceptualizing dominance and prestige is with the interpersonal circumplex. The interpersonal circumplex includes a vertical axis of agency characterized by items like influence, status, and control, and an orthogonal dimension of communion, characterized by items like friendliness and warmth. So this suggests that you can be high in agency and low in communion, like a dominant individual, or you can be high in agency and high in communion, like a prestigious individual. And we can use this interpersonal circumplex to derive hypotheses about what the nonverbal communication of dominance and prestige might look like. For example, the first behavior that comes to mind is smiling. Smiles elicit perceptions of warmth, liking, and trustworthiness. People are oriented to approach and affiliate with smiling individuals, suggesting that smiling is going to increase perceptions of communion, whereas the lack of smile will lead to low perceptions of communion. Next, expansiveness is a behavior also heavily cited in terms of its relationship to social rank. Expansiveness increases perceptions of high rank for individuals across cultures and ages. High rank individuals show more expansive nonverbal behaviors, and larger individuals are perceived as more knowledgeable and also more likely to win fights, suggesting that expansiveness is going to be related to agency, not specific to dominance or prestige. Finally, we've talked about the body, we've talked about the face. What about the head? Well, a downwards head tilt increases perceptions of things like dominance, intimidation, anger, agency, and low communion, making it very likely to be a unique signal of dominance. Whereas an upwards head tilt increases perceptions of things like pride, happiness, agency, and high rank, making it likely to communicate prestige. So, to wrap this up a bit more concisely, we're expecting these three behaviors, a smile, an upwards head tilt, and expansiveness, to contribute to perceptions of prestige. whereas these three behaviors, no smile, a downwards head tilt, and expansiveness, to contribute to perceptions of dominance. So the first thing that we want to do is go ahead and manipulate all of these behaviors. Show participants all possible combinations of nonverbal displays and see if dominance and prestige are associated with distinct sets of behaviors. So to do this, participants were shown 12 expressions. Half of them were smiling, half of them were not. Half of them were expansive, half of them were not. And a third had their head tilted down, a third had their head level, and a third had their head tilted up. Participants saw each of these and rated each target on how prestigious or dominant they thought the target was, using a validated measure from past research. First, turning to smiling displays, targets who were smiling were rated as more prestigious than targets who were not smiling, but the opposite pattern emerged for dominance. Smiling actually decreased perceptions of dominance. Next, looking at expansiveness, expansiveness increased perceptions of prestige and also increased perceptions of dominance. And finally, turning to head tilt, an upwards head tilt led to the highest perceptions of prestige, higher or equally as high as a level head or a downwards head tilt, whereas a downwards head tilt led to the highest perceptions of dominance. So, generally, it looks like we do have initial support for our hypotheses. These behaviors, no smile, a downwards head tilt, and expansiveness, were associated with dominance, whereas these three behaviors, expansiveness and upwards head tilt and a smile, were more closely associated with prestige. But we wanted to go ahead and replicate this, so we ran several more studies, and I'm not going to go into too much detail about these now, but we used all different kinds of stimuli, methods, prompts, and some of these studies had over 1,000 participants. And instead of going through all of these individually, I'm just going to show you one representative study from the set. This study recruited nearly 1,000 workers from Amazon Mechanical Turk, and participants were randomly assigned to one of 8 targets. All participants saw this one target demonstrating 4 nonverbal displays in a 2x2 array. They were shown the prestige display, a neutral expression, a smiling display, so a neutral expression just with the addition of a smile, and finally they were shown a dominance display. And all participants were asked one single question. They were either asked, please select the person who's likely to be a leader because he or she is willing to use aggression and intimidation to get his or her way. This is how we operationalize dominance. Or participants were asked, please select the image of the person who's likely to be a leader because he or she is accomplished, admired, and possesses useful knowledge and expertise. And this is how we operationalize prestige. Now, because participants chose between 4 nonverbal displays, chance was at 25%. And we find that nearly 70% of the time, a rate far greater than chance, participants are accurately selecting the dominance display in response to the dominance prompt. Next, turning to prestige. Again, chance is at 25% because participants are selecting between 4 nonverbal displays, and participants are selecting the prestige display in response to the prestige prompt, at a rate far greater than chance. You'll also notice that a large proportion identified the smiling display as prestigious, which actually makes a ton of sense, given that the smile is one of the most important components of the prestige display. But nonetheless, participants are still selecting the prestige display at a much higher rate. So all of these studies that I've showed you, we have people looking at photos and making selections. And the next thing that I wanted to do is kind of take this next step and look at the role that these behaviors actually have in real-world status competitions. Does anybody actually show these behaviors when trying to get status in the real world? And do individuals who demonstrate these behaviors emerge as leaders and demonstrate an ability to influence the behavior of others? So the way that we did this is we had participants come into the lab in groups of up to 6 people, and they were video recorded as they completed the Lost on the Moon task. Now this task requires that group members rank order a list of 15 items in terms of their utility for surviving a crash landing on the moon. So this includes items like oxygen, food, water. And after doing this independently, they came together as a group to come up with a final group list. After coming up with this final collaborative list, group members rated each other on prestige, dominance, and social influence. So how influential they were in coming up with this final list. Target effects were derived using social relations model, and I'm not going to go into too much detail about that here, but in brief, this means that dominance and prestige ratings are made based on group consensus. But to get a second measure of social influence in the group, we also had 2 research assistants, blind to the hypotheses, indicate how influential each of these group members were. We took 8 time points from each of these videos, and we had 2 research assistants code the nonverbal behaviors displayed by each participant. Specifically, we looked at upwards head tilt, downwards head tilt, smiling, and 6 behaviors which we use to operationalize expansiveness. Now, for the next little bit, I'm going to talk about expansiveness as this single variable that is an amalgam of all of these 6 behaviors, but later I'm going to break these apart and look at these separately. Turning to our results, I'm going to show you how these nonverbal behaviors were related to dominance and prestige target effects. First, people who displayed expansiveness emerged as both dominant and prestigious. Individuals who displayed an upwards head tilt emerged as prestigious but not dominant. Individuals who smiled emerged as prestigious and not dominant. Finally, for a downwards head tilt, well, this is one thing that didn't really support our hypotheses. But that said, when we look at these prestige behaviors, we found some really exciting effects and things that we wanted to dig a bit deeper into. Now, these behaviors were pretty highly intercorrelated with each other, so we standardized them and averaged them together to create a single prestige display variable. This prestige display predicted prestige target effects, did not predict dominance target effects, and also predicted social influence target effects, so how influential these people were, again based on group consensus. And this effect was mediated by prestige target effects, but not dominance target effects. When we swap out social influence target effects with outside observer ratings, we see the same effect emerges. Now, I mentioned that previously we combined a bunch of different behaviors to look at expansiveness as a single variable, but let's go ahead and break these apart and analyze these separately. Now, this is exploratory, so please interpret it with caution. But as I said a couple slides ago, individuals who engaged in expansive nonverbal behaviors emerged as more dominant and more prestigious. But when we break this apart, it looks like items like chest expanded, torso pushed out, was more closely related to prestige than dominance. Whereas arms out, body occupies much room, wide stance, was more closely related to dominance than prestige. Finally, arms up wasn't clearly related to dominance or prestige. So, I know I'm painting in broad strokes a bit, but it seems like behaviors relating to sitting up straight and confidence signaling might be more closely related to prestige than dominance, whereas behaviors that involve taking up large amounts of space might be more closely related to dominance than prestige. And if nothing else, I think it's clear that expansiveness is more than one thing. Expansiveness is often talked about as this unidimensional construct, and this isn't totally far-fetched. As I mentioned, all of these behaviors were pretty highly correlated. When we put them into a single variable, their Cronbach's alpha is 0.84. But these divergent relationships show that expansiveness might be a multifaceted construct. Now, the last study I'm going to present for you today, I wanted to try and get a real-world example of this, as it unfolds in real time. Lucky for us, right around the time of this research, the 2016 US presidential debates were going on. Now, this was a great opportunity to assess dominance and prestige. It's a real-world setting where people are battling for power. So we wanted to use these debates as an opportunity to assess whether these distinct displays emerged by a dominant strategist and a prestigious strategist, both battling for power. Now, I was of the opinion that Donald Trump was a dominant strategist, whereas Hillary Clinton was more of a prestige strategist. And to be clear, I wasn't alone. As early as 1992, well before Trump made a real run for president, research and decision-making was identifying Trump as a prototypical independent maximizer, or somebody willing to undercut group goals to achieve their own personal goals. And this is almost exactly how we measure dominance. For example, one of the items from the dominance scale is I often try to get my own way, regardless of what others may want. Trump also participated in more attack ads compared to all other presidential candidates, including Hillary Clinton, which could certainly be construed as an aggressive strategy. But before hastily labeling Trump and Clinton as a dominant and prestige strategist respectively, I wanted to validate this perspective empirically. Well, there are two ways we can go about doing this. One way is to ask people what they think of Trump and Clinton, an observer-report method. Another way is to analyze their behavior during the debates to see if they behave in ways prototypical of dominance prestige strategists. Well, thankfully, one paper already did this first step. In a pretest, Kakar and Savanthan asked 120 MTurk participants to rate Clinton and Trump on a shortened version of the dominance and prestige scales, similar to the one we use in all of our studies. They found that Hillary Clinton was perceived as more prestigious than Donald Trump, and Donald Trump was perceived as more dominant than Hillary Clinton. To further validate this perspective, I wanted to look at their actual behavior during the 3 presidential debates. So we did some verbal content coding. 2 coders went through all 3 presidential debates to identify 2 types of events for both candidates. For prestige, we focused on demonstrations of expertise, and for dominance, we focused on attacks. First, turning to the evidence for dominance and prestige based on our verbal content coding. We found evidence that Hillary Clinton engaged in a greater proportion of the total demonstrations of expertise, whereas Donald Trump engaged in a greater proportion of the total attacks. So, with Trump as our dominant strategist and Hillary Clinton as our prestige strategist, we went back to all of these time points and had 3 nonverbal behavior coders identify the behaviors displayed by each of these candidates across the entire debate. Now, when we look at the behaviors demonstrated by each candidate, a pretty interesting pattern emerges. For all 3 prestige behaviors, smile, an upwards head tilt, and chest expanded, they were displayed with a greater intensity by Clinton when compared to Trump. But for all dominance behaviors, downwards head tilt, arms out, body occupies much room, they were displayed with a greater intensity by Trump when compared to Clinton. And finally, arms up, which as I showed you in the last study wasn't clearly related to dominance or prestige, wasn't shown with a greater intensity by either candidate. Now, I do want to quickly point out that there's a pretty critical limitation of this study. Notably, gender is confounded with candidate. So interpret these results with caution. But the good news is, with the current political climate, it's likely that Trump and Biden might be facing off in the near future, which is going to give us another opportunity to see whether Trump, a dominant strategist, is likely to engage in these dominance displays. So where does this leave us? Well, it looks like there are distinct sets of nonverbal behaviors associated with dominance and prestige. Dominance is associated with a downwards head tilt, no smile, and expansiveness, whereas prestige is associated with an upwards head tilt, a slight smile, and expansiveness. It looks like there could also be some differences in the kinds of expansive behaviors demonstrated by dominant and prestigious individuals. These displays elicit distinct perceptions of dominance and prestige from observers, and when displayed by leaders, it actually helped them influence the behavior of their group members, particularly for prestige. Finally, the dominance behaviors were displayed more by Donald Trump, a validated dominance strategist, whereas the prestige behaviors were demonstrated more by Hillary Clinton, a validated prestige strategist. But this research is far from complete. I've started looking at how these displays generalize across cultures, ages, and guide the conferral of rank across various different contexts. And if you're interested in any of the work that I didn't have time to cover today, please don't hesitate to email me. I'd love to talk and find a way to collaborate. But that said, I want to go ahead and thank everybody who made all of this work possible, and most importantly, thank you for listening.